In 1969, a struggling hotel chain built a nameless little pub in Massachusetts just to save itself. Nobody expected that pub to outlive the company that built it. They called it the Ground Round. At its peak, it had over 200 locations across 19 states. Free peanuts covered the floor in a crunchy carpet nobody minded sweeping. Kids ate ice cream out of little baseball caps. Families paid for their children's dinner by the pound, 1 penny per pound, and nobody blinked. Grandparents brought parents, parents brought kids. For 20 years, it was where working-class America went to feel, just for one dinner, like they belonged somewhere warm. Then, on one ordinary Friday afternoon in February 2004, at exactly 5 o'clock, nearly 60 of those restaurants locked their doors forever. Diners were still holding their forks. Hey, how does a chain that fed 3 generations disappear in a single afternoon, with no warning and no goodbye? This is the story of what the Ground Round really was, and how it all came apart. The Ground Round wasn't born out of ambition. It was born out of fear. By the late 1960s, Howard Johnson's was the largest restaurant chain in America. 1,000 orange roofs stretched along every major highway from Maine to Florida. But the company's entire business model depended on one thing: Americans driving long distances and stopping to eat along the way. And that model was about to break. The 1973 oil crisis was still a few years off, but the warning signs were already there. Gas prices were creeping up. Highway traffic patterns were shifting. Howard Johnson's executives could see it coming. A slow bleed of the long-distance traveler, the very customer their restaurants were built around. They needed something else, something that didn't depend on tourists passing through, something that depended on neighbors. So in 1969, in the quiet town of Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, Howard Johnson's opened a different kind of restaurant. No orange roof, no ice cream counter facing the parking lot. Instead, a dim, wood-paneled pub with a bar up front and booths in the back. The kind of place that looked like it had been there for decades, even on its opening day. They called it the Ground Round. The menu had exactly 12 items: char-broiled burgers, served in plastic baskets lined with wax paper, a handful of sandwiches, beer on tap. That was it. No printed specials, no seasonal rotations. Just a short list of things done consistently, night after night, for people who lived 5 minutes away and would be back next Tuesday. The idea behind it was almost radical for its time. A restaurant with no rules. Come in your work boots. Come in a suit. Bring your kids, bring your date, bring your whole bowling league. Nobody was going to look at you twice. The dining room had a low bar for adults to unwind after a long shift, and it had high chairs for toddlers 3 tables over, both at once without apology. On opening night, the smell alone was different from anything Howard Johnson's customers knew. Char-broiled beef instead of soft-serve vanilla, beer instead of milkshakes. The lighting was low and amber, more tavern than diner. Regulars from the mill towns and factory floors around Shrewsbury wandered in, not entirely sure what to make of it. A Howard Johnson's property that didn't look, sound, or smell like Howard Johnson's at all. But it worked. Word spread fast in a town that size. Within weeks, the booths were full on weeknights, which was something the company's highway restaurants rarely saw. Howard Johnson's had built the Ground Round to solve one problem: the slow decline of the road trip customer. What they got instead was something nobody in the boardroom had fully planned for: a neighborhood institution, the kind of place a town claims as its own. Nobody in Shrewsbury that first year could have guessed that this one small pub, with its 12-item menu and its low amber lights, would grow into one of the chains that taught America how to eat out. They also couldn't have guessed how it would end. By the early 1980s, the Ground Round wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a Friday night ritual for millions of American families. Walk through the door of any Ground Round in 1982, and the first thing that hit you wasn't the menu, it was the sound. A cartoon flickering on a big screen bolted to the wall. Kids laughing at a table nearby. The low murmur of a bar full of adults who just clocked out. And underneath all of it, the steady crunch of peanut shells under everyone's shoes. The peanuts were the signature. Every table got a basket, refilled without asking. And the rule, the unspoken, delighted rule, was that you didn't clean up after yourself. You just dropped the shells on the floor and let them pile up. By the end of a busy Saturday night, the floor of a ground round looked like the inside of a ballpark, and that was exactly the point. It wasn't messy, it was permission. Permission to relax, to not worry about manners, to let a 5-year-old be a 5-year-old. Then there was Bingo the Clown, a costume mascot who worked the dining room on busy nights, table to table, making kids laugh while their parents got a few quiet minutes with a beer and a burger. For a lot of children who grew up in the Northeast and Midwest in that era, Bingo wasn't a marketing gimmick. He was a genuine piece of their childhood, right up there with the Tooth Fairy. And then there was the food, presented with a kind of theater no other family restaurant was doing at the time. Ice cream didn't come in a bowl. It came in a tiny plastic baseball cap, and kids wore the empty cap home like a trophy. Chocolate mousse arrived in a miniature flower pot, topped with crushed cookie crumbs made to look like dirt, with a gummy candy worm poking out the top. It sounds like a small thing now. In 1983, to an 8-year-old, it was pure magic. Dessert that looked nothing like dessert and tasted like a birthday. But nothing captured what the ground round meant to families quite like pay what you weigh night. On select evenings, a child's meal cost exactly 1 cent for every pound they weighed. Parents would lift their kids onto the scale right there by the host stand, laughing while the whole family watched the number tick up. It turned dinner into an event, for families counting every dollar. And in the recession years of the early 80s, that was a lot of families. A few dollars for a full kid's meal wasn't just a discount. It was a reason to go out at all. Former servers who worked the floor in those years remember the noise of it more than anything. The hum of a packed Friday dining room, families spilling into the waiting area by 6 o'clock, the bar 3 deep with regulars who came in every week without fail. One longtime employee at a Northeast location recalled that during the peak years, the restaurant didn't just serve dinner, it hosted birthdays, Little League team celebrations, first dates for teenagers too nervous for anywhere fancier, and after-church Sunday meals for families who'd been coming since the restaurant opened. The brand's reach wasn't accidental. By the mid-1980s, the Ground Round had grown into one of the chains, alongside names like TGI Fridays and Bennigan's, credited with inventing what the restaurant industry now calls casual dining. Before Ground Round, going out to eat as a family usually meant a diner counter or a formal dining room with a dress code. Ground Round split the difference. Real food, a real bar, and zero pretension. It gave working class and middle class families a version of going out that didn't cost a fortune and didn't make anyone feel like they didn't belong. For a child who grew up going to the Ground Round in those years, the memory isn't really about the burgers. It's about the whole sensory wrapping of the place. The smell of char-broiled beef mixing with fresh peanut shells. The flicker of cartoons on the wall. The sound of a clown's shoes squeaking across a floor covered in shells. The exact moment the ice cream arrived in its little plastic cap. What was it about a restaurant with peanut shells on the floor that made an entire generation feel like they were somewhere safe? Nobody sitting in those booths in 1983 had any reason to think it would ever end. The parking lots were full. The waiting list stretched out the door on weekends. The company was opening new locations across the Northeast and Midwest every year. The Ground Round felt less like a restaurant chain and more like a fixture of American life, as permanent as the highway itself. But permanence is rarely what it looks like from inside a full dining room. Somewhere behind the scenes, far from the peanut shells and the cartoons, decisions were already being made that would determine how this story ended. Success has a way of demanding more of itself, and by the mid-1970s, the Ground Round was being asked to grow faster than anyone at Howard Johnson's had originally planned. The turning point was the 1973 oil crisis. As gas lines wrapped around city blocks and long-distance road trips became a luxury few families could afford, Howard Johnson's watched its highway restaurants, the orange-roofed backbone of the entire company, bleed customers who simply weren't driving anymore. Executives needed a growth engine that didn't depend on the interstate, and the Ground Round, built from the start around neighborhood customers rather than travelers, was sitting right there with the answer already proven in Shrewsbury. The company shifted resources hard in Ground Round's direction. where Howard Johnson's had a second casual concept in development at the time, a steakhouse chain called Red Coach Grill. It was Ground Round that got the green light to scale first. By 1975, just 6 years after that first pub opened, there were 64 Ground Round restaurants open across the Northeast, already outpacing Red Coach Grill's more modest rollout. The message from headquarters was clear. This was the concept worth betting on. The growth that followed over the next decade was staggering for a chain that had started as a single experimental location. New restaurants opened not just in fresh construction, but inside the shells of underperforming Howard Johnson's properties. Highway locations that weren't pulling in road traffic anymore got gutted and rebuilt as neighborhood pubs, peanut shells and all. It was an efficient way to grow. The real estate was already owned, the kitchens were already built, and all that changed was the concept inside the walls. By 1985, 16 years after that first Shrewsbury location, the Ground Round had grown to 215 restaurants. Enough that Howard Johnson spun the brand off as its own separate company that year, no longer just a side project, but a business substantial enough to stand on its own. Franchisees across the Northeast and Midwest signed on to open their own locations, drawn by a concept that had already proven over and over that it could turn a struggling property into a packed dining room. Those franchise owners weren't faceless investors. Many were local businessmen who'd grown up in the towns where they opened their restaurants. People who saw firsthand what a full parking lot on a Friday night meant for a main street that was otherwise struggling. Owning a Ground Round wasn't just a business decision for them. It was a chance to build something their own neighbors would actually show up for, week after week, in towns from Bangor, Maine, to Grand Forks, North Dakota. But growth at that speed came with a quiet tension that would only become visible years later. Every new location needed to feel exactly like the one down the road. The same peanuts on the floor, the same 12-item menu turned into a much longer one as the years went on, the same low amber lighting, and the same easy, no-rules atmosphere that had made the original so beloved. Maintaining that consistency across hundreds of restaurants, run by dozens of different franchise owners with their own instincts about what customers wanted, was a harder job than it looked from behind a single bar in Shrewsbury. For the employees hired during these boom years, expansion meant real opportunity. A teenager bussing tables in 1978 might be managing his own Ground Round location by the mid-1980s, riding the wave of a company opening new restaurants faster than it could always staff them properly. For others, especially at the corporate level, that same speed meant mounting pressure, more locations to oversee, more menus to standardize, more decisions being made further and further away from the dining room floor where the actual experience lived. The original Shrewsbury restaurant, meanwhile, became something almost symbolic. The flagship that started it all, now just one location among hundreds bearing its name, a physical origin point for a chain that had outgrown its own hometown many times over. By the time the Ground Round stood on its own in 1985, it had already achieved something remarkable, transforming from a single defensive experiment into one of the restaurant chains that had helped define an entire category of American dining. The company was no longer trying to survive, it was trying to lead. And for the next several years, it would. By the early 1980s, the Ground Round had crossed a line that very few restaurant chains ever reach. It stopped being a place people went to eat and became a place people simply belonged to. The numbers alone told part of the story. The chain had grown past 200 locations, stretching across roughly 19 states, concentrated most heavily through the Northeast and Midwest, a footprint dense enough that in dozens of towns, going to the Ground Round needed no further explanation. Everyone knew which building you meant, what the parking lot looked like on a Friday night, and roughly how long the wait would be. But the deeper measure of the brand's reach wasn't in its location count. It was in who was walking through the door. By this point, going to the Ground Round wasn't a single generation's habit. It was a ritual passed down. Grandparents who remembered the chain's earliest years in the 1970s were now bringing their own grown children back, who in turn brought their kids to sit under the same flickering cartoon screen, drop peanut shells on the same style of floor, and get the same little baseball cap bowl of ice cream their parents had once gotten. Few casual restaurants of that era could claim 3 generations of the same families as regulars. The ground round could, town after town. That kind of loyalty didn't happen by accident. The chain had positioned itself deliberately as something more than a business, a fixture woven into the civic life of the towns it served. Ground round locations sponsored Little League teams. They hosted birthday parties that became annual traditions. Local chambers of commerce and community groups held meetings in back rooms that had at some point quietly become the ground round room in the town's collective memory. For a franchise owner, the restaurant wasn't just a storefront. It was a piece of the town's identity, and the town in turn showed up for it. Inside the restaurants during these peak years, employees described something close to controlled chaos on the best nights. A dining room running at full capacity, a bar three deep with regulars, servers moving fast between tables where kids were being weighed for their penny-a-pound dinner, and where couples on quiet dates sat two booths away. Working a Friday shift at a ground round in 1983 meant being part of something that felt, night after night, like the center of the town's social life. For many employees who started as teenagers, it was their very first job, and for a lot of them, it stayed one of their fondest. The brand's cultural footprint extended beyond its own dining rooms too. Alongside chains like TGI Fridays and Bennigan's, the Ground Round was credited by the restaurant industry with helping invent an entirely new category: casual dining. Before these chains, American families choosing to eat out generally faced a stark choice: a no-frills diner counter or a formal dining room that demanded a jacket and a reservation. The Ground Round and its peers created a third option that had barely existed before: real food, a real bar, and a genuinely relaxed atmosphere, priced within reach of a factory paycheck or a teacher's salary. That third option didn't just succeed, it became, over the following decades, the dominant way America eats out, which meant the Ground Round wasn't just popular in its moment, it was present at the birth of an entire industry. What made a restaurant with peanut shells on the floor feel like a second home to so many families in so many different towns at exactly the same time? There is no single answer, but the closest one might be this: the Ground Round asked nothing of its customers except to show up as they were. No dress code, no pretension, no sense that you needed a special occasion to justify the cost. For families who had very little room in the household budget for going out, that was everything. A genuine treat that never once made them feel like they didn't belong there. By the mid-1980s, sitting inside a packed Ground Round on a Saturday night, there was no visible reason to think any of it was fragile. The parking lots were full. The waiting list stretched to the door. The chain had just been spun off from Howard Johnson's as its own independent company, seemingly strong enough to stand entirely on its own 2 feet. But the very forces that had built this golden era, rapid growth, franchising, a chain now spread across hundreds of locations and multiple ownership structures, were quietly setting the stage for problems that wouldn't surface for years. The peak, it would turn out, was not the same thing as stability. In 1985, standing inside a packed Ground Round on a Friday night, nobody could have pointed to a single thing wrong. The dining rooms were full. The peanut shells still covered the floor. The brand had just proven itself strong enough to be spun off from Howard Johnson's and stand entirely on its own. But independence, it turned out, was only the beginning of a much more complicated story, one that most customers wouldn't notice for years. The trouble started, as it so often does, with ownership. Once separated from Howard Johnson's, the Ground Round became a company that could be bought and sold. And over the following years, it was repeatedly. The franchise operation passed to American Hospitality Concepts. Ownership shifted again to Hanson Group USA. 3 years after that, it changed hands once more, acquired by International Proteins Corp. Each transaction came with its own new leadership, its own new financial priorities, and often its own new debt taken on to fund the purchase. A restaurant chain that had spent its first 15 years focused on what happened inside the dining room was now spending an increasing amount of energy on what happened inside a boardroom hundreds of miles away. The second crack ran through the menu itself. What had started in 1969 as a deliberately tight 12-item menu, burgers, sandwiches, beer, nothing more, had grown decade by decade into something far larger and far less focused. Item after item was added to chase new customer segments, new dining trends, new competitors entering the casual dining space. Every addition made sense on its own. Together, they diluted exactly what had made the original concept work. A short, consistent, reliably excellent list of things done well, night after night, by kitchens that could actually keep up with it. And the competition wasn't standing still. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, a new generation of casual dining chains arrived with sharper branding and deeper marketing budgets. Chili's brought Tex-Mex flair and aggressive national advertising. Applebee's built a model designed specifically for suburban growth, expanding into exactly the kind of markets where Ground Round had once had the field mostly to itself. Both chains felt to a new generation of diners, more modern, more current, than a chain whose signature gimmick was a costume clown and ice cream served in a plastic baseball cap. What had once felt playful and fresh in 1975 started by 1995 to feel dated to customers who had other options now. None of this was visible from inside a single dining room on any given night. A regular walking into their local Ground Round in the late 1980s still got the same peanuts, the same burger, the same booth they always sat in. The slow erosion was happening at the level of market share and brand perception, invisible to the customer, but painfully visible to the people running the company. One longtime franchise owner in the Midwest, who had operated his restaurant since the 1970s, later described watching corporate ownership change hands again and again through the late 80s and 90s with a growing unease he couldn't quite name at the time. Each new set of executives arrived with new priorities, new cost-cutting directives, new ideas about what the brand needed to compete, and each time, a little more of what had made the original concept distinctive got negotiated away in the name of modernization. He kept his restaurant running the way it always had. He wasn't sure, some weeks, whether corporate even knew what made his location work. Did anyone inside the company watching Chili's and Applebee's pull ahead year after year understand just how little time was actually left? The honest answer is complicated. Some executives clearly saw the writing on the wall. Internal memos and industry reporting from the period reference concern about the chain's aging image and its struggle to differentiate itself in an increasingly crowded casual dining field. But recognizing a problem and having the capital, the unified leadership, and the time to fix it were three very different things. And the Ground Round, cycling through new owners every few years, rarely had all three at once. Each new ownership group inherited not just the brand, but the debt and the unresolved problems left behind by the group before it. By the time Boston Ventures Management acquired the chain in 1997, the Ground Round was a company running out of room to maneuver. The peanuts were still on the floor. The dining rooms in many locations were still respectably full. But underneath the surface that customers could see, the foundation had been quietly weakening for over a decade. And the next set of decisions, made far from any dining room, would determine whether the chain survived at all. When Boston Ventures Management acquired the Ground Round in 1997, the company inherited a chain that still looked, from the parking lot, like a going concern. What it actually inherited was a business running on borrowed time and borrowed money. And the decisions made over the next 7 years would determine not just the fate of a restaurant chain, but the livelihoods of thousands of people who had no seat at the table where those decisions were made. The core problem was structural, and it had been building for years before Boston Ventures ever arrived. The company had pursued an aggressive refranchising strategy, selling off company-operated restaurants to independent franchise owners in an effort to raise cash and reduce direct operating risk. On paper, it looked like a reasonable move. In practice, it created a lopsided company. The restaurants that remained under direct corporate ownership were disproportionately the weaker performers. The locations franchisees hadn't wanted to buy, propped up by a shrinking pool of company resources, while the stronger franchisee-run restaurants operated at a healthier distance from headquarters' financial troubles. The corporate side of the business was, in effect, holding the weakest cards while still needing to service growing debt. That debt was the second half of the equation, and it had been accumulating since the very first change of ownership back in the 1980s. Every sale of the company, from American Hospitality Concepts to Hanson Group USA to International Proteins Corp., and finally to Boston Ventures, had been financed in part through borrowed capital. Each new owner inherited not just a restaurant chain, but a balance sheet already strained by the leverage used to buy it. Money that might have gone toward remodeling aging dining rooms, refreshing a menu that had grown bloated and unfocused, or investing in marketing to compete with Chili's and Applebee's, instead went towards servicing debt payments on transactions that had happened years before most current employees had even been hired. Inside individual restaurants, the effects of these boardroom decisions were felt in small, cumulative ways that added up to something much larger. Maintenance budgets tightened. Remodels that other chains were rolling out to modernize their look never made it to many ground-round locations, leaving dining rooms that had felt warm and inviting in 1983, starting to feel simply old by the late 1990s. Portion sizes and food costs came under quiet pressure as management looked for savings anywhere they could find them. Long-serving employees at several locations later recalled noticing the kitchen doing more with less. Recipes simplified. Sourcing shifted toward cheaper suppliers. Changes so gradual that no single one felt like a crisis, but that together amounted to a restaurant slowly becoming a thinner version of what it used to be. For the franchise owners who had built their livelihoods around the brand, men and women who had, in many cases, opened their restaurants back in the 1970s and 80s and watched their towns grow up around them, the widening gap between corporate and franchise operations created a particular kind of frustration. They had invested their own capital, their own reputations, their own decades of relationships with regular customers into restaurants that were, by any honest measure, performing better than the company-owned locations down the road. Yet they had no real control over the corporate decisions that were steadily eroding the value of the name on their sign. One franchise owner in the Midwest later described the feeling as watching someone else slowly spend down an inheritance that was supposed to be shared. There were people inside the company, at various points, who saw the danger clearly. Industry reporting from the period makes clear that concerns about the chain's aging brand image, its inconsistent quality, and its mounting leverage were not secrets confined to outside analysts. They were understood at some level by people inside the organization itself. But understanding a problem and having the authority, the capital, and the unified leadership to fix it were different things entirely. With ownership changing hands roughly every few years throughout the 80s and 90s, no single leadership team stayed in place long enough to see a turnaround strategy through to completion. Each new owner arrived with fresh optimism and a fresh plan, inherited the unresolved damage of the owner before them, and left before the deeper structural problems, the debt, the lopsided corporate versus franchise split, the aging brand, were ever fully addressed. By the early 2000s, the arrangement had become fragile in a way that wasn't visible from a dining room booth, but was entirely visible to the lenders holding the company's debt. Foothill Capital Management and Boston Ventures Management, the two entities providing the credit facilities that kept the company-owned restaurants operating day to day, were watching a business that could no longer comfortably service what it owed. The company-owned locations, the weaker half of the business by design, the legacy of years of refranchising, were the most exposed of all. Who exactly was supposed to protect the thousands of employees and career franchise owners whose entire livelihoods depended on decisions being made in a boardroom they had never sat in? There is no satisfying answer, only a chain of individually defensible decisions. Refranchise to raise cash, borrow to fund each acquisition, cut costs to service that debt, that collectively left almost no margin for error. And in February of 2004, that margin ran out completely. What happened next would not be a slow decline that gave anyone time to prepare. It would be immediate, and it would happen without warning to the very people who had spent decades building their lives around a restaurant that, by then, existed mostly on paper, as a set of credit agreements between lenders who had simply decided they were finished. Friday, February 13th, 2004, started like any other Friday at the Ground Round. Servers were setting up for the dinner rush. Kitchens were prepping for a weekend that in most locations would be one of the busiest of the month. Nobody working the floor that afternoon, not the servers, not the managers, not the franchise owners 3 states away, had any indication that within a few hours the company they worked for would no longer exist in the form they'd always known it. The trigger came from outside the restaurants entirely, in the offices of 2 financial institutions, Foothill Capital Management and Boston Ventures Management, the lenders providing the credit facilities that kept the company's roughly 60 corporate-owned restaurants running day to day, made the decision that afternoon to terminate those credit lines. It was a financial decision, executed with financial timing by people who likely never set foot in a single dining room affected by it, but the consequences landed immediately and physically, in real restaurants, on real people, in the middle of a Friday dinner shift. By 5 o'clock that evening, every one of the nearly 60 company-owned Ground Round restaurants had been ordered closed. Not by the end of the week, not by the end of the shift, by 5 o'clock that same day. What followed has been described by the people who lived through it as something close to chaos. Diners in the middle of their meals were asked to leave, in some documented cases, walking out with half-eaten food packed into to-go containers they never asked for, because the kitchen was shutting down mid-service and there was nowhere else to put the plates. Servers were told, often with almost no notice, that their shift in an emergency and their job was over, effective immediately. Nation's Restaurant News, covering the shutdown at the time, described the scale and suddenness of it as something the restaurant industry hadn't seen in recent memory. Mass layoffs and hasty lockups that caught employees, customers, and even many of the company's own franchise owners equally off guard. Roughly 3,000 employees lost their jobs that single afternoon, with no advance warning at all. And for many of them, the damage didn't stop there. In the days that followed, as employees tried to cash their final paychecks, some discovered the checks bounced. There wasn't enough money left in the company's accounts to cover even the wages already earned for hours already worked. People who had shown up for their shifts in good faith, expecting an ordinary Friday, ended that week having lost both their jobs and the pay they were owed for the work they'd already done. 5 days later, on February 19th, the franchisor, American Hospitality Concepts, formally filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, making official what had already happened on the ground days earlier. For the franchise owners, the men and women who had built their own individual restaurants over years and sometimes decades, the situation was its own particular kind of nightmare. Not because their restaurants were forced to close, but because of the confusion the corporate collapse created around them. The 72 franchise-owned locations spread across 19 states were not directly part of the bankruptcy. Many of them, in fact, had been performing better financially than the corporate-owned restaurants that had just shut down. But that distinction meant almost nothing to the public. As word spread through local news and word of mouth that the Ground Round had collapsed, confused customers in towns with perfectly healthy, independently owned locations simply assumed the whole chain was gone. Sales at surviving franchise restaurants dropped in the following weeks, not because those restaurants had done anything wrong, but because they shared a name with a corporate entity that had just imploded overnight, taking thousands of livelihoods down with it in a single afternoon. One franchisee, recalling the day years later, described dialing into a routine conference call with corporate that Friday and being told with almost no preamble that the 59 remaining company-owned stores were closing that same day. It wasn't the news itself that stayed with him so much as the tone of it. Matter of fact, procedural, delivered like a scheduling update rather than the end of an era that had defined entire communities. He and dozens of other franchise owners, who together had built careers and reputations around this brand, learned in that same phone call that decisions made entirely without them had just put everything they'd built at risk. For customers, the experience was quieter, but no less disorienting. A family that had eaten at their local Ground Round every few weeks for 15 years, Might drive past one weekend and simply find the parking lot empty, the windows dark, a note taped to the door, or in some cases, no explanation at all, just a restaurant that had always been there and now wasn't. There was no farewell tour, no final week of nostalgic promotions, no chance to say goodbye to a place that had hosted a decade of birthdays and after-church Sunday dinners. For the restaurants directly caught in the corporate shutdown, the ending arrived with less ceremony than a single ordinary Tuesday closing. When a place that had always simply been there suddenly isn't, with no warning, no explanation, and no chance to say goodbye, what exactly does a community lose beyond the building itself? In the weeks after February 13th, the surviving franchise owners faced a choice. Let the brand die completely or find a way to hold on to it themselves. 71 of them, operating restaurants they had built with their own money and their own decades of work, chose the second option. They organized into a cooperative, the Ground Round Independent Owners Cooperative, LLC, and moved to purchase the rights to the brand out of the very bankruptcy that had almost destroyed it. It was, in its own way, an act of defiance. A group of local business owners in Freeport, Maine, and towns like it, refusing to let a corporate collapse 3 states away erase everything they'd spent their careers building. But even that act of defiance couldn't fully undo what had happened. The corporate infrastructure that had once supported hundreds of restaurants was gone. The 71 locations that survived under the new cooperative ownership represented a small fraction of the chain's peak footprint of well over 200. The Ground Round that emerged from bankruptcy in 2004 was by necessity a much smaller, much more fragile version of the brand that had once been present in 19 states. The single afternoon of February 13th, 2004, had done what a decade of slow decline hadn't managed to do on its own. It turned the Ground Round almost overnight from a national chain into a modest regional survivor. One that would spend the next 2 decades simply trying to hold on to whatever it had left. In the years that followed the collapse of February 2004, the story of the Ground Round became less about what was lost and more about what the survivors chose to do with what remained. The Ground Round Independent Owners Cooperative, formed by the 71 franchise owners who refused to let the brand disappear entirely, purchased the chain out of bankruptcy for roughly $5 million, $2 million of which came directly out of the franchisees' own pockets. It was a striking commitment from people who had already watched corporate mismanagement nearly destroy everything they'd built. Over the following years, the cooperative did something the corporate ownership chain that preceded it had never managed. It paid down the company's outstanding debt completely, finishing the job by 2011. For the first time in over a decade, the Ground Round belonged, in a very real sense, to the people actually running its restaurants. But paying off debt didn't reverse the deeper damage. The brand that emerged from bankruptcy was a shadow of its peak footprint. 71 locations instead of well over 200, concentrated mostly in the Northeast and Midwest towns where loyal franchise owners had simply refused to give up. And even that smaller number kept shrinking. Through the 2010s and into the 2020s, restaurants closed one by one, sometimes because an aging owner was ready to retire after 30 or 40 years behind the same counter, sometimes because the pandemic made an already thin business impossible to sustain. A sports-themed variation of the concept, launched in 2013, aimed to modernize the brand for a new generation, but it never came close to reversing the slow contraction. By the mid-2020s, only a handful of locations remained. A few scattered restaurants in North Dakota and Ohio, run by owners who had simply outlasted everyone else. What replaced the Ground Round in most of the towns where it once stood wasn't a single dramatic competitor. It was the broader shift the chain itself had failed to survive. The rise of Applebee's, Chili's, and a wave of newer casual dining concepts with fresher branding and deeper marketing budgets, better equipped to weather the ownership churn and debt loads that had crippled Ground Round from the inside. In some towns, the old building simply became something else entirely. Another restaurant, a retail space, sometimes torn down altogether, the site giving no outward sign that it had once been a place where 3 generations of a family gathered every few weeks for burgers and peanut shells. For the employees who lost their jobs in the 2004 collapse, The paths afterward varied widely. Some found work at the surviving franchise locations or at competing chains, carrying decades of hospitality experience into new uniforms. Others, particularly longtime managers and career servers who had built their entire working lives around one restaurant, struggled to find anything that replaced what they'd lost. Not just a paycheck, but a community of regular customers and coworkers built up over 15 or 20 years. For the 71 franchise owners who survived the bankruptcy, some managed to hold on for decades more, becoming, in effect, custodians of a brand that had otherwise vanished from corporate America entirely. The broader lesson of the Ground Round's collapse extended well beyond one restaurant chain. It became something close to a cautionary case study in the restaurant industry. Proof of what happens when a beloved consumer brand gets treated primarily as a financial asset. Bought, sold, leveraged, and refinanced by a rotating cast of owners, more focused on debt structures than on the dining rooms actually generating the revenue. The Ground Round wasn't undone by changing tastes alone, or by a single bad decision. It was undone by a slow accumulation of financial decisions made far from any restaurant, each one individually defensible, that together left no room for the company to survive one bad afternoon. Decades later, remarkably, the story found an unexpected final chapter. In 2024, a young Massachusetts couple, Joseph and Nachi Shah, purchased the intellectual property rights to the nearly dormant brand, by then reduced to almost nothing, the name available cheaply enough that they needed no outside investors to acquire it. In the summer of 2025, they opened a new Ground Round in Shrewsbury, the very town where the very first location had opened in 1969, 56 years earlier. Longtime locals showed up not just to eat, but to bring pieces of the past with them. Old menus, employee manuals from the original restaurant, even a pair of suspenders one woman had worn while working there decades before. It wasn't a national comeback. It was something smaller and, in its way, more honest. Proof that the memory of what the Ground Round once meant had never actually disappeared, even after the company built around it had. When a gathering place like this disappears, and then, against every expectation, someone tries to bring a small piece of it back, what does that tell us about what a community actually needs from a restaurant? Beyond the food on the table, the economic impact of the 2004 collapse rippled through the towns that depended on the Ground Round as more than just a place to eat. Local economies lost steady employers. Main streets lost anchor businesses that had drawn foot traffic to smaller shops nearby. And an entire generation of children who had grown up celebrating birthdays under a flickering cartoon screen grew into adults who could no longer take their own kids to the same place. What the Ground Round left behind in the end wasn't just an empty building in Shrewsbury or Bangor or Grand Forks. It was a gap in the ordinary rhythm of American family life that nothing else, not Applebee's, not Chili's, not any of the chains that came after, ever quite filled the same way. Somewhere tonight, in a house in Massachusetts or Maine or North Dakota, someone in their 60s is telling their grandchild about a restaurant with peanuts on the floor. They're describing the smell first, char-broiled beef mixing with fresh cracked shells, the low amber light of a dining room that always felt like early evening, no matter what time you walked in. They're describing the sound of a cartoon flickering on a screen, bolted to the wall, and a clown named Bingo working the tables, and the particular thrill of being lifted onto a scale by the host stand while your whole family watched the number tick up. Because tonight, your dinner cost exactly what you weighed. They're describing ice cream that came in a tiny plastic baseball cap you got to keep, and a chocolate mousse dessert dressed up like a flower pot, dirt and all, because someone back in 1975 decided that dinner with your family should feel a little bit like magic. The grandchild listening will never taste any of it, but they'll understand, from the way it's being described, that something real was here once. Something warm, something particular to a certain America in a certain decade before it was gone. What made the Ground Round matter was never really the burgers. Burgers were everywhere. What the Ground Round offered for a little over 3 decades was a version of going out to eat that asked nothing of the families who walked through its doors. No dress code, no formality, no sense that this was a special occasion you had to earn. A factory worker and his family could sit two booths down from a first date, and neither would feel out of place. A grandmother could bring three generations at once, and everyone had somewhere to belong, from the bar up front to the high chairs in back. In towns across the Northeast and Midwest, the restaurant became something closer to a civic fixture than a business. The place that sponsored the Little League team, hosted the birthday parties people still remember by name, gave a generation of teenagers their very first job and their very first paycheck. It offered working class and middle class families something that felt, for one evening at a time, like abundance, a full meal, a full room, a full sense of belonging, at a price that didn't require justifying to anyone. And then, on one Friday afternoon in February, it was simply gone. Not faded slowly, the way most old chains disappear, quietly losing locations year after years until people barely noticed the last one closing. This one ended with diners still holding their forks, with 3,000 people learning in a single conversation that the job they'd shown up for that morning no longer existed, with paychecks that bounced for hours already honestly worked. That kind of ending leaves a different kind of mark. It isn't just nostalgia for a menu, it's grief for a version of American life. Steady jobs, neighborhood loyalty, a business that stayed in one place long enough to matter to three generations of the same family, that the ending itself seemed to prove was no longer guaranteed to anyone. The people who lived it deserved to be remembered plainly, without exaggeration, and without blame laid at any one door. The servers and cooks and managers who built real careers inside those dining rooms, some for 20 years or more. The 71 franchise owners who refused to let a corporate collapse erase what they'd built with their own money in their own hands, who organized, who paid off every dollar of debt they inherited, who kept the lights on in Freeport and Bangor and Grand Forks long after the name had vanished from the national conversation. The founders' original idea, born out of nothing more than necessity in 1969, a struggling company needing a way to serve its own neighbors instead of passing travelers, that somehow grew into a genuine piece of how an entire generation remembers being a family. And there is, improbably, a small light at the end of this story. In a storefront in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, in the very town where the very first Ground Round opened its doors, two young owners with no outside investors and no guarantee of success are trying, in their own small way, to prove that what this place once meant hasn't fully disappeared. Locals have shown up carrying old menus and employee manuals and a pair of suspenders worn behind that same bar decades ago. Proof that the memory never actually left, even after the company built around it did. The Ground Round is mostly gone now, but for the people who were there, who dropped peanut shells on the floor without a second thought, who got weighed at the host stand, who wore an empty ice cream cap home like a trophy, it was never really about the restaurant. It was about a version of American life that once made room for everyone. No matter what you were wearing or how much was in your wallet, that's worth remembering, and it's worth keeping.